Hamilton Police Services called me at 6:30 on a Thursday morning in February to say they had found a woman in her car at Bayfront Park. Carbon monoxide. They were calling it a suicide. She had a piece of paper in her coat pocket with my phone number written on it, labeled Dad. I told the officer he had the wrong man. I don't have a daughter. My son lives in Toronto with his wife, and I have no daughters, no nieces, no goddaughters who would ever write that word next to my number. The officer asked me to come in anyway. His voice had that particular flatness you develop when you've delivered too much bad news to too many people. I am Calvin Reed. I am 67 years old, and I spent 41 years working the floor at the Stelco plant in Hamilton before my knees and the plant itself both gave out around the same time. My wife Doris died 4 years ago last October. I live alone in the same house on Barton Street East, where we raised our son Thomas and where I have lived since 1987. It is not a large house. The front porch lists slightly to the left and the furnace makes a sound in January that I choose to ignore, but it is mine. It smells of cedar and old paint and the lavender sachets Doris used to tuck into the linen closet. After she was gone, I left them there. I drove myself to the station in my old Silverado with the heater running on full and ice still on the windshield at the edges where the defroster never quite reached. Hamilton in February is a particular kind of gray, the kind that settles into your bones and tells you spring is a rumor. They showed me her face through a window in a room that smelled of antiseptic and cold. She looked thin, then I remembered her. Her hair was cut short and dyed a color it had never been before, and her skin had the pallor of a woman who had been afraid of thee for a very long time. But I would have known that face anywhere. I had watched it across my kitchen table for 6 years. I had watched it light up when she laughed at Doris's jokes. I had watched it crumple the night she told me she and my son were having difficulties. It was Margot, my son's first wife, the woman who had been declared legally dead after a car went into the Credit River 5 years ago and no body was ever recovered. The woman whose memorial service I sat through while my son Thomas wept and Rebecca Ashworth sat beside him and placed her hand over his like she already knew the timing. I pressed my forehead against the glass and did not speak for a long time. The officer, a young man named Constable Brewster, spoke first. "Mr. Reed, do you recognize this woman?" I said yes. My voice sounded far away to my own ears. "Her name is Margot. She was my daughter-in-law." "Was?" "She was declared dead 5 years ago. A car accident. No body was ever found." He wrote something down. I watched him write. His pen moved carefully, as though he understood the weight of every word. I am not a man who panics easily. 40 years on a mill floor teaches you to assess a situation before you move. You learn to read the sound of equipment, to know the difference between the groan of normal stress and the groan that means something is about to fail. Standing in that corridor, I read the situation. The paper in her pocket with my number. The fact that she had been found in Hamilton, not Toronto where Thomas lived, not wherever she had been hiding. The fact that it was February and the car had been running long enough to kill her. But Bayfront Park is open parkland and someone would have noticed a running car in that lot on a cold night, well before any meaningful time had passed. I asked Constable Brewster if there were signs of a struggle. He paused too long before saying no. I asked if there was a note. He said there was not. I asked what else she had in her pockets besides the paper with my number. He gave me the look of a man who felt I was asking too many questions for someone who had just identified a body. Then he told me she had a burner phone with a dead battery, $3.40 in change, and a child's mitten. One mitten, pink, with a small embroidered rabbit on the cuff. A child's mitten. I stood there in that corridor and understood that I had been handed the beginning of something enormous. Something that had been building for 5 years while I sat on my porch with my bad knees and my grief and my silence, never asking the right questions because I had believed what I was told. They released me after 2 hours. I sat in the parking lot with the engine idling and I thought about my son. He had remarried 18 months after Margot's memorial. Rebecca Ashworth, daughter of Harrison Ashworth Sr., who had built half the condominiums in downtown Toronto and donated generously to enough provincial campaigns that his name appeared on the Queen's Park guest list more often than most elected officials. Thomas had met her at a charity auction. I had smiled at the wedding and kept my doubts to myself. I drove to the Children's Aid office before I drove home. Because the mitten told me there was a child, and wherever that child was, she was alone and frightened. It took 4 phone calls to reach the right person. A worker named Ms. Darby, who had the voice of someone running on 12-hour shifts and who had stopped being surprised by anything years ago. She confirmed that a young girl had been brought in the previous evening, found wandering alone near the Tim Hortons on King Street East, approximately 5 years old, would not give her name, no identification. But inside the lining of her coat, sewn by hand in careful stitches, was a rectangle of fabric on which someone had written, in ink, "If something happens, take her to Calvin Reed, 44 Barton Street East, Hamilton. Her grandfather. He will know what to do." I had to pull over to the side of the road. I had a granddaughter. Her name, it turned out, was Lily. She told me herself in a whisper when I sat down on the floor of the playroom at the shelter and held out the half-eaten package of digestive biscuits I had bought from the vending machine in the lobby. She was small for 5. She had Thomas's coloring and Margot's dark eyes and the careful, measuring look of a child who had learned very young that the world was not always safe. She looked at me for a long moment, then she said, "You look like my dad." I said, "I might be your grandfather, my name is Calvin." She considered this. Then she climbed into my lap and fell asleep in under 3 minutes. The kind of sleep that comes from complete and sudden exhaustion, the way children sleep when they have finally reached safety and their bodies simply surrender. That night I made Lily scrambled eggs and toast. She ate quietly. She asked if her mother was coming. I said her mother loved her very much. It was the truest answer I had. I could not sleep. I sat in Doris's chair in the living room, and I thought about the things I should have questioned 5 years ago. The accident that produced no body. The speed with which Thomas had moved on. The way Rebecca had inserted herself into every family occasion before the grief was even cold. Always gracious, always composed, always there. The fact that Margot had no family of her own to press for answers. No parents, no siblings, just a few friends who had drifted away in the year before she disappeared. The way the people who love you can vanish without anyone left to ask where they went. At 2 in the morning my phone buzzed. A text from Thomas. It said, "Dad, the police told me they called you. I know this is a shock. Please don't do anything yet. Rebecca and I are coming to Hamilton tomorrow. We'll explain everything. Please don't talk to anyone. Please don't talk to anyone." I looked at Lily sleeping on the fold-out couch under Doris's old quilt, her small fist curled under her chin, and I put my phone face down on the table. In the morning I called Hector. He had been the union steward at Stelco for 18 years, and he knew more about how things actually worked in this province than most lawyers twice his age. He had a bad hip and a good mind, and he owed me $200 from a hockey pool that neither of us had ever formally collected on. When I told him what had happened, the line went quiet. Then he said, "Calvin, you're about to step into something that was designed to stay buried. You understand that?" I said I understood. He said, "Good, now tell me the daughter-in-law's maiden name." "Rebecca Ashworth. Harrison Ashworth Sr.'s daughter." Hector knew the name. Anyone in this province who paid attention to development approvals and political donations knew the name. The Ashworth family had their fingerprints on half the rezoning decisions in the GTA over the past 20 years. Harrison Sr. had not gone to prison for any of it, but the reason for that was widely understood to have more to do with money than innocence. Hector made 3 calls that morning. By noon he had sent me a document. It was a PDF of a will. Harrison Ashworth Sr.'s will, filed with an Ontario notary, containing a clause specifying that his estate, valued publicly at somewhere north of $200 million, would transfer to Rebecca only on the condition that her marriage to Thomas Reed remained intact and legitimate. The clause also specified that any evidence of an invalid prior marriage on Thomas's part would result in the full estate reverting to a charitable foundation under Ashworth Sr.'s control, effectively cutting Rebecca out entirely. I read the document twice, then I understood everything. Thomas and Margot had married quietly in 2014, a small ceremony at a conservation area outside of Guelph, with a justice of the peace and 2 witnesses. I had not been there. Thomas told me about it afterwards sheepishly over the phone, saying Margot had wanted something simple. I had been hurt at the time but let it go. When Margot disappeared and was declared dead, the marriage dissolved. Thomas filed for a death in absentia declaration through the courts 18 months later. Rebecca would have known all of this. She would have orchestrated all of this. A living woman had been made legally dead, and the man who married that woman had stood at another altar and lied to God and everyone watching. My son's marriage to Rebecca was void. I drove to Toronto on a Thursday morning. I took the 403 to the QEW and arrived at the house in Rosedale before the street was fully awake. It is the kind of neighborhood where the houses are worth $4 million, and the gardens are tended by people who are paid not to be noticed. Thomas answered the door in a bathrobe. He looked terrible. His eyes were red. He had the look of a man who had not slept and who had spent the night rehearsing something he did not want to say. I said, "She's dead, son." He nodded and stepped back. I said, "She had a daughter, your daughter. She is 5 years old, and she is sleeping in my house right now under your mother's quilt." He closed his eyes. I said, You are going to sit down and tell me everything, not the version that protects your wife's inheritance, the truth. We sat in the kitchen. He told me in a voice that grew quieter as it went that Margot had not died in that car accident. He had known it. Rebecca had arranged it. A story, a vehicle, a police report guided by a detective on the Ashworth family's informal payroll. Margot had been given a choice: disappear permanently and receive monthly support payments through a numbered company, or be destroyed publicly through fabricated abuse allegations, fake financial records, and the full legal weight of the Ashworth family's retained firm. Margot had chosen to run. She had been pregnant when she left. Thomas had known she was pregnant. I looked at my son. He could not look back at me. She said she would report me to the CRA. She had documentation ready showing falsified business expense claims. It was enough to put me away for years, Dad. I was scared. I said, and you chose this. He did not answer. That was when Rebecca appeared in the kitchen doorway, dressed and composed and holding a cup of coffee, looking at me the way you might look at a slow-moving vehicle that has temporarily blocked your lane. She sat down and folded her hands and spoke about how Margot had been unstable, how Thomas's first marriage had been a mistake they had both recognized, how the arrangement they had made was generous and fair. She said Lily would be provided for. There was a fine private school in Switzerland. She had already made inquiries, where children from complicated situations were known to thrive. She said that she understood I must be upset, but that the sensible thing was to allow the family to handle this privately. She said the word privately the way certain people say it, meaning where my money operates and your morality does not. I let her finish. Then I said, Margot was Thomas's legal wife at the time you married him, which means your marriage is void, and your father's estate under the terms of his will goes to his charitable foundation, not to you. The composure did not leave her face, but something changed behind her eyes. She said, I would be very careful, Calvin. You are 67 years old. You live on a pension. You are currently in unlicensed temporary care of a minor who is legally unrelated to you. One call to Children's Aid and Lily goes back into the system. One call to the right people and your finances get flagged for a CRA audit. These things take time to sort out. Time an elderly man on a fixed income may not have. I looked at Thomas. He was staring at the table. I stood up. I said, I want you to know that I recorded this conversation. I pulled my old iPhone out of my jacket pocket and pressed stop. Her jaw tightened. That was all. I walked out of that house and drove back to Hamilton. The next 3 days were the hardest I have ever lived. Children's Aid came to my door on a Tuesday afternoon with a worker and a court order obtained on the basis of an anonymous report alleging that Lily was in an unsuitable and unlicensed home. They took her. She clung to the doorframe and called my name, and I stood on the front step with my hands at my sides because I understood that if I moved, if I stepped toward that car, Rebecca would use it against me in whatever proceedings she had already set in motion. I went inside and sat at the kitchen table for an hour. Then I called Hector, and Hector called his cousin. Her name was Vera Beaumont, and she practiced family law in Oakville. She called me and listened without interrupting for 40 minutes while I told her everything. At the end, she said, Do you have the recording? I said I did. She said, And there's a phone from the deceased? I told her about the burner phone and its dead battery, which I had taken from the police as part of Margot's effects. Vera said, Bring me everything, and stop talking to Thomas. While Vera worked through the legal channels, I went looking for what Margot had left behind. She had been careful and methodical. She had been running for 5 years. She had learned not to trust institutions or banks or any system that could be accessed by people with money and connections. But she had trusted me. I thought about the one place she and Thomas had been happy, the conservation area outside Guelph where they had married. I drove out on a Wednesday morning in the thin February light. The park was closed for the season. The gate was padlocked. I parked on the shoulder and walked in along the tree line, my boots breaking through the crust of old snow. There was a picnic shelter near the pond. Thomas had described it to me once, years ago, when he finally told me about the wedding, the way the light had come through the trees, the way Margot had laughed when the justice of the peace mispronounced her middle name. Inside the shelter there was a wooden bench. Below the bench, fixed to the underside with weatherproof tape that had held through 5 Ontario winters, was a metal document case no larger than a hardcover book. Inside, a copy of the original marriage certificate, a handwritten letter addressed to me personally, explaining everything she had been through and why she had run. Photographs of Lily, dozens of them, from infancy to the autumn just past. And a USB drive containing 5 years of bank transfer records from the numbered company to an account in Margot's assumed name. Every payment, every documentation that she had been alive, and paid and coerced every single month since the day they told the world she was dead. I drove back to Hamilton, I scanned everything and sent it to Vera. Then I sent a copy to 2 journalists, one at the Toronto Star, one at the CBC, whose names Hector had given me. The following Saturday, Harrison Ashworth Sr. was hosting a fundraising dinner at the Royal York Hotel in Toronto. 250 guests, a provincial cabinet minister on the guest list, a promise of a substantial check to a children's literacy foundation. Vera had obtained an emergency family court hearing that same afternoon, and the judge, after reviewing the materials, had issued an order returning Lily to my temporary care, pending a full custody hearing and a police investigation. I was at the Royal York at 7 o'clock in the suit I had worn to Doris's funeral. I did not go through the front door. I went through the catering entrance, because Hector knew a man who worked banquets there, and who had left the service door propped open. I walked into the ballroom while Harrison Ashworth Sr. was at the podium, speaking about the importance of investing in children's futures. I did not shout, I did not run. I walked to the front of the room with enough purpose that people stopped talking. When a 67-year-old man in a suit that is slightly wrong for the room walks like he belongs somewhere, most people step aside without understanding why. I said, "Mr. Ashworth, I have something that belongs to your family." I held up the marriage certificate. The room went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something is happening that everyone can see is going to matter. I said, "Your daughter's marriage to my son is legally void. Margot Chen Raid was his legal wife. She did not die, she was forced to disappear. She had a daughter that your family tried to erase. That little girl's name is Lily. She is 5 years old. She is staying at my house on Barton Street, and she is not going anywhere." Rebecca stood up from the head table. She was controlled, but her face had gone white. Her father looked at her for a long moment. I watched him understand. He had known, I realized. Not everything, but enough. He had known, and he had allowed it because the alternative was too expensive. The journalist from the CBC was at the back of the room. The photographer from the Star was beside her. The RCMP arrived 20 minutes later. They were efficient and professional, and they did not make a scene. They spoke to Harrison Ashworth Sr. privately in the corridor. Then they came back for Rebecca. She walked past me on the way out, very controlled, her face blank in the way that faces go blank when the person behind them has retreated somewhere internal and is trying to decide what remains salvageable. She said, "This isn't over." I said, "I know, but the most important part is." Thomas was arrested the following Monday. He did not contest it. He had called me the Sunday before, and I had answered, and he had spoken for a long time, and I had mostly listened. I do not think I will ever fully forgive him, but I do not think I will never forgive him either. He is my son. He chose wrong out of fear, and fear is not an excuse, but it is a thing I understand. I put the phone down without saying much. There will be time later for whatever comes after this. The cause of Margot's death was ruled a homicide 6 weeks after the investigation opened. 2 men whose phones had pinged towers near Bayfront Park that night had known connections to a security contractor the Ashworth family retained. That case is still before the courts. Rebecca received 7 years. Harrison Sr. cooperated with investigators in exchange for reduced charges related to obstruction. The detective on the Ashworth payroll received 4 years. Vera secured full temporary guardianship for me within 30 days. The custody hearing confirmed it 3 months later. It is June now. The porch still lists slightly to the left. I had the furnace looked at in March, and it turned out to need nothing more than a new igniter switch, which cost me $140 and has changed the quality of my sleep considerably. Lily starts school in September. She chose a backpack with a rabbit on it. I did not tell her about the mitten, maybe someday. She calls me Grandpa Calvin sometimes, and just Grandpa other times, and once at the grocery store she called me Dad by accident and then looked mortified, and I told her it was fine. It was more than fine. It was the best thing anyone has called me in 4 years. I think about Margot every day. I think about the years she spent running, the years she spent keeping that child safe and loved in whatever circumstances she could manage, never reaching out to me because she was afraid that contact would put us both in danger. She was trying to protect me. She died protecting her daughter. She was braver than anyone in that Rosedale house or that Royal York ballroom will ever understand. I put her photograph on the mantel next to Doris's. They look right there, side by side. The 2 women who loved the people in my family the most. The 2 women who deserved better from the men who were supposed to show up for them. Lily sees the photograph every morning when she comes downstairs for breakfast. She touches the frame with 2 fingers. Then she sits down and eats her toast and doesn't say anything. And I don't say anything either. And somehow that silence between us is not empty at all. Some mornings she asks me to braid her hair, and I have to tell her honestly that I am not very good at it, but I am willing to learn. We are figuring it out together. That seems to me to be the right way to do most things.